and welcome to CGTN's special TV forum, Afghanistan in Transition. I'm Tian Wei. It has been a year since U.S. forces left Afghanistan. Its government and people have been working on getting their conflict-weary country back on its feet. Yet the past decades of war and conflict have left Afghanistan badly scarred with a crippled economy. Now, the greatest challenge is brewing humanitarian crisis. To drum up international attention and awareness on the situation in Afghanistan, CGTN, along with our partner, Shamshad TV in Afghanistan, present Afghanistan in Transition. This is the first co-production between the two major media networks of both countries, and the discussions are hosted from studios in our Beijing headquarters of CGTN and also in Kabul. Today, we have invited people in the know, both inside and outside Afghanistan, to unpack the real situation on the ground. First, I also want you to meet with our guest here in the CGTN Beijing headquarters, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo from the Center for International Security and Strategy of Tsinghua University. Senior Colonel Zhou served earlier in the Chinese Defense Ministry. Pierre Khanbo, who is the personal special envoy of the president to China by the International Committee of the Red Cross. And also now we have our guest in the Kabul studio joining us as well, with my colleague Xu Zhaoqun there. Xu Zhaoqun has been there for about 2 weeks to present the real life of people in Kabul, together with other colleagues of CGTN. Today, he brings us people there. So Zhaoqun, please introduce us the guests in our studio there.
Hi there, Tian Wei. Nice to see you this way. As you see, I'm now sitting in the Kabul studio of Shamshad TV, and I'm going to bring you the Kabul section of this joint production by CGTN and Shamshad TV. As you can see, the three gentlemen have been here. First of all, Mr. Abdul Kahal Barki, the spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the second one is Mr. Mohammad Suleiman, the former Deputy Minister of Industrial and Commerce. And Professor Saeed Zikrullah Hashimi. Mr. Hashimi is an economist and a political analyst. So, gentlemen, welcome to our studio. Tian Wei.
Thank you so much, Xu Zhaoqun, and welcome to all of you, gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. The humanitarian situation is highly concerning for neighboring countries and international organizations. How serious is the crisis and what needs to be done to aid those badly in need? First, let's take a listen to the keynote speech given by Mr. Martin Griffiths, who is the Under-Secretary General of the Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator of the United Nations.
Dear friends, I'm pleased to address you on an issue I am passionate about: helping the people of Afghanistan towards the road to recovery. Speaking on behalf of the humanitarian community, I can report that since last August, we have mounted a massive humanitarian response. We reached 97% of the 24.4 million people in need. These efforts helped us avert a famine last winter, but we can't slow down. 19 million people, which is nearly half the population, remain food insecure. That includes 6.6 million people at emergency levels of food insecurity, the largest number in one single country in the world today. We need a proactive and sustained response to reduce the risk of famine. And at the same time, we've less than half of the funding needed to help these people. So we face three main challenges. First, economic shocks. These are now the primary driver of humanitarian need across Afghanistan. People are earning far less or nothing at all. The number of families receiving remittances from outside the country has halved since last year, and a shocking 40% of adults are unemployed. Inflation has also increased, and more than half of people's income is spent on food. A staggering 25 million people now live in poverty, up from 20 million in 2016. Second, people have been pushed over the edge by natural hazards and climate shocks over the years. Afghanistan is facing its worst drought in 30 years. And in the past 5 weeks, a deadly earthquake and flash floods claimed more than 1,000 lives and destroyed thousands of homes. We've reached 85% of the people affected by the earthquake with assistance, and 20 aid teams are now assessing the needs of people caught in those floods. Third, women and girls face an alarming rollback on their rights. But humanitarian response alone will not be enough. And to resolve these challenges, 3 critical areas need urgent attention. The economy must be supported. The formal banking system must be restored and reconnected with the international financial system. Basic services, such as health and water, must be strengthened and preserved. And we need to restore women's and girls' human rights. Girls must have access to secondary education and beyond. Other restrictions on women's movement also affect their ability to access life-saving assistance. To the people in Afghanistan, I want to say, we are with you. And to the world outside, let's join hands and stand by the Afghan people in solidarity. Thank you.
Martin Griffith from the United Nations. 20 years of war and conflict have left Afghanistan with deep scars and humanitarian disasters that are hard to heal. According to the United Nations, 19 million people in Afghanistan are food insecure, almost half of the country's population. Food prices hiked nearly 30% last year, and more than 800,000 Afghans were displaced inside the country in the year 2021 alone. 80% were women and children. The outside world is curious about the real picture in the country and very concerned about humanitarian disasters on the ground. I believe my colleague Xu Zhaojun, together with your guest in Kabul, will have more on-the-ground information for us. Now to you.
Thank you very much, Tian Wei. Thanks very much for the information, the facts and figures we have, gentlemen. We've got plenty of facts and figures from Beijing, and would like to have your response to these things. So my first question goes to Mr. Barkey. Do you agree with what Mr. Griffith, the Undersecretary, says? And is the humanitarian situation really as severe as he described in his speech?
Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here and address the international audience about the current situation of Afghanistan from the perspective of the government of Afghanistan. I would like to begin by thanking the Undersecretary for his efforts and also for the United Nations and other organizations that are here trying to alleviate some of the pain and suffering of the Afghan people through their humanitarian work. Secondly, I do not fully agree with the assessment of the Undersecretary. The reason is twofold. One is that the vast majority of the population of Afghanistan is rural-based and has an agriculture-based economy. They rely on the agriculture and the lands that they cultivate. So to that end, the lives of the people of the rural community has actually improved dramatically in terms of security, of them being able to tend their lands and tend to their crops and harvest. And also the second reason is the markets and our relationships that have improved with our neighboring and regional countries, which have opened markets for them, and we have doubled our exports in agriculture sector and also in the mining sector. But more to the agriculture sector, we're continuing to work with neighboring and regional states in order to increase the amount of Afghan exports, vegetables, fresh fruits, dry fruits, and the other resources. I do agree when it comes to the urban class of Afghanistan. The sad fact is that Afghanistan, the economy of Afghanistan was war-driven and it was artificial. It was unsustainable from the very beginning. And we do agree with the Undersecretary that the bourgeoisie or the middle class of Afghanistan is suffering tremendously basically there is no longer a middle class in Afghanistan. And the reason is, as the foreign troops and occupying forces pulled out of Afghanistan, they not only ended the jobs and opportunities that were provided to the middle class that worked in the government departments and also with the NGOs and the embassies, but they also imposed, the US and the UN imposed illegal and immoral sanctions on Afghanistan, which has only exacerbated the situation. We, as the government, have taken steps to try to alleviate and help the Afghan people. In the immediate term, we have allowed vast access to humanitarian actors that want to help, charity organizations, UN organizations, to address the immediate needs of the people. In the short term, we have encouraged the growth of the private sector and incentivized them with tax exemptions and creating a favorable environment for them to operate in and invest, providing them security and the other resources needed for them to thrive. The midterm approach of the government is trying to realize the connectivity projects of Afghanistan, which has twofold effect. One is creating jobs for the people of Afghanistan, and the second is creating the basic infrastructure, so states that are willing to invest in some of the vast resources of Afghanistan can do so with confidence. And the long-term approach, of course, is realizing the full potential of Afghanistan as the heart of Asia and turning it into a hub of trade, transit, connectivity, and also an exporter of energy. We have huge potential in Afghanistan when it comes to energy.
Yes.
But sadly, over the last 20 years, none of these have been realized or even talked about. So the government is doing whatever it can within its capacity, and it has tried to mitigate the effects of it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Barki. As a spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry, I think you have a deep insight in economy affairs. And second question for Mr. Suleiman, what would you think about the Undersecretary's comments and Mr. Barki's comment? And another question is that what's your insight on the inflation now, which has been considered a sharp inflation, damaging the life of the ordinary people?
Thanks, Shu. Thanks for having me. I think I'll begin with the fact that the current state of the economy, which we have right now in Afghanistan, I simply call it a free-fall economy or free-fall state that we are experiencing right now. And it is the result of the cruel sanctions imposed on Afghanistan and also some policy actions by the IEA, the new or current government of Afghanistan. I think we have to look back at the fact that when Taliban took over Kabul last year, immediately sanctions were imposed. And at the same time, which is very important, our correspondence banking just stopped. So our private sector, our investors, our industrialists, they simply cannot do business with the rest of the world. And so higher cost of business means, laying off a lot of jobs. Close to 1 million people have lost their jobs. And please, we're not talking about 1 million people. These are 1 million families, more than 1 million families who are dependent on these jobs. And particularly mothers and babies who are affected. Another setback that has received, I think, is by the labor market. We do not have anything to offer to the 600,000 young people that are coming into the job market every year. Yes. So there are limited opportunities, and you can see a brain drain for a justified reason or economic migration for the justified reasons. Businesses, young innovators, founders, startup owners, businesses led by women, artists, artisans, all are trying to leave Afghanistan and have left Afghanistan in quite a significant number over the last year just because we have economic issues. So I believe that we do not have food shortages, we do not have resource shortages. In fact, it is the inability of Afghans to have income levels, to have jobs in the current situation. And as I said, it is the result of the indifference of international and regional powers. It is the cruel imposition of these sanctions and our inability to do correspondence banking with the rest of the world. I think the situation is extremely serious. There is a liquidity crisis right now happening in Afghanistan. And if certain concrete actions are not taken by all parties involved, we will be witnessing a very worse or dire situation in the coming future as well.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suleiman. And one more question for Mr. Balki. We have got plenty of reports from the international media about the health system in Afghanistan. What about the hospitals here? We were told that some of the hospitals or the healthy systems are facing collapsing. They're about to collapse. Is that true? And what policies have you taken to improve the healthy system?
The health sector of Afghanistan was in shambles for the last 20 years. It is not something new. It is something that has been inherited. As a matter of fact, we can claim that it was non-existent. Even over the last 20 years, Afghans were forced to seek treatment in Pakistan, in India, and in other regional and neighbor states, because Afghanistan simply lacked the capacity to handle such issues. Currently, there's 3,700 hospitals and health clinics providing primary, secondary, and tertiary care to the people of Afghanistan. The government of Afghanistan has worked with the model that existed and has managed to work closely with UN and other health organizations, international health organizations, to try to revive the Sehat Mandi programs and others. So currently in the 3,700 hospitals, we have managed to bring in the resources, the supplies, the medicine, and other resources needed to have a stable, a semblance of stable healthcare system. We are able to provide salaries to the doctors and the nurses who are providing the care. We have also created jobs with the vaccine programs, with the COVID programs, and also other vertical programs that are related to the health, the Ministry of Public Health. And our overall performance, I believe, and this can also be attested to by the international actors that are working here, is vastly improved from what we had before. And the government also has plans in place to try to reach a stage where we are no longer reliant on foreign donations for a state to have a health system. It is something that is very cruel, that has been imposed on Afghanistan. But we're working on a plan to try to have a sustainable system that is self-reliant on the resources of Afghanistan.
Okay, thank you. One more question about the people who are forced to leave their home. Professor, we know several hundred thousand have been forced to move away from their homeland. Do you know any plan for the government to improve that situation?
Thank you for having me in this discussion. First of all, you know, the occupation governments, which is within the last 20 years, they destroyed everything. They don't have any stable project here in Afghanistan to find jobs. And there was a lot of corruption in the jobs system also, the people who's working. The second thing, as you know, the third countries in the world, usually the people looking to have a chance to go outside of the country. I think it is almost 50 or 60% if the people who's taking this opportunity to have go outside of the country, because Afghanistan was within last 43 years in the war, and there is no good chances. So for them it was golden chance to leave Afghanistan and have a good chance there. I don't think it is exactly from now situation, because the government within this 1 year, according to my analysis, I found that they have a very good movement. First of all, they fighted the corruption. The corruption rate, it is coming very down, and it's maybe around 1 to 2%. Exactly, they removed. The second things, they have working on that. Like yesterday, the Education Ministry was announced that they have 243 employment in the ministry, and 92,000 of them, they are female. And also the employment, new employ 16,000 people in the education ministry. It does mean they're working for job creation and also for the development of the country. So these people who's leaving Afghanistan, I not accept that for the situation. But it is using that chance which is created by United States and NATO here in Afghanistan, and they giving them this opportunity to leave these people the country, because as you know, the economic problem in the Europe and also United States, they need for the people who have experience. So they want to take out these people and take a benefit for that. Okay. So I think this not really maybe.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, gentlemen. I believe Tianwei and our guest in Beijing may have a lot of questions for you. So Tianwei, if you have any questions.
Thank you, Zhao Qun. And certainly we've been hearing very tentatively in the Beijing studio of all the earlier sophisticated answers given by the three gentlemen. Let me just follow up on some of the things you just said with every one of you very briefly. Mr. Suleiman, you are with the earlier administration. You criticize the international communities for lack of attention right now for Afghanistan as we focus today on the humanitarian crisis. Tell me more about what do you see as the biggest priority for humanitarian crisis? So money, efforts, time can be more concentrated on.
Well, I think it's a very important question. Well, certainly the international attention has deviated. I think we have, we all understand that we have a war in Ukraine, so a lot of international attention is over there, and Afghanistan is receiving lesser and lesser of attention in the last 1 year. It has been decreasing for sure. Yes, Afghanistan received close to $1 billion in humanitarian aid this year, but again, it's not a sustainable way to help the Afghan economy, and it's just giving us fish and not teaching us fish. So that's why I pointed out the indifference of regional powers as well in this regard. I think it's economic migration happened in Afghanistan in the past as well, and as spokesperson Balkhi said, there is attention now towards agriculture and mining, which is great, but I think it's not sufficient enough to revive the economy.
Yeah.
There needs to be a lot of issues with prudent economic governance in Afghanistan, inclusivity, and presenting a big vision to the private sector of Afghanistan so that we can come together and work for the development of the country. I think also the attention has declined because of Biden's administration's inability to deal with the issue of Afghanistan, of the shameful exit that they had in August last year. So I think it's just not only one issue at home or abroad, it's a combination or a mix of issues in the international arena as well as in regional and in our home affairs that have crippled the economy, that has destabilized. I would say our economy has not collapsed, it's rather demolished by the international community at large, particularly the United States, and also certain policy actions by the EIA in terms of taxation and others.
On that, I want to go to Mr. Balkhi. Also, thank you for briefing us about what the current administration in your country is doing. But how are you trying to figure out a way of functioning? Because we see you are facing multiple layers of challenges. One is the international situation Mr. Suleiman talked about. The other is the stability issue in your own country and the governance issue of this administration. And thirdly is a vast humanitarian crisis that is ongoing. So how are you trying to figure out the most important points right now as the starting point?
Thank you very much. Again, I agree to a large extent with some of the remarks that our fellow Afghan made earlier. There is always room for improvement. The steps that the government has taken are not sufficient. We do not say that they are sufficient. What we try to say is that we have taken steps. There's this perception that we do not know our priorities, that we do not have the capabilities, that we do not have the competency to address these needs. That is a notion and an idea that I'm trying to contend, that The humanitarian crisis that exists in Afghanistan is due to the sanctions and due to the asset freezes and due to the commercial banking and the Central Bank of Afghanistan unable to operate, which in turn is affecting the private sector. So there's a problem in the public sector and also in the private sector, which all derives or takes root from the international factor. When it comes to the humanitarian situation, our priority currently is, as I alluded to earlier in my remarks, the immediate term goal is to allow access to international humanitarian bodies and charity organizations to enter Afghanistan and have access to every single part or every corner of the country to address the basic needs of Afghanistan when it comes to flour, sugar, cooking oil, shelter, and other basic needs like health. This is the priority of the government at this very moment. Then we have plans, there's a midterm plan and there's short-term and also a long-term plan, a vision for Afghanistan that we have, which is an Afghanistan that is sustainable and self-reliant.
Yeah.
Coming to the governance issues, again, I do not agree with the assessments. Yes, every government has room for improvement. We have never said that this government is the final form and there will be no improvements made to this government. There will be no new talents added to it. We will continue to work in a manner that does not create more challenges for the state of Afghanistan, where that compounds the problems. And the humanitarian crisis is what it is. I personally do not agree with the assessment of the Undersecretary, but I do agree, yes, there is. The urban class is suffering tremendously because the war economy and that created jobs for people in the urban sector at the cost of the lives and the livelihoods of the rural class. They are being affected, and these are the places where these supposed transformations and progress and achievements have taken place.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Yet it is these people that are facing the collective punishment by the United States and the occupation forces.
Thank you, sir. Let me come back. Since you talk about the links between Afghanistan today and the humanitarian groups around the world, we are having one person representing many of the groups' presence in Afghanistan. Pierre, you listened to our guests. What about that link? How much difficulty is there between your organization, for example, and others, humanitarian organizations, serving Afghanistan, linking to the Afghan government right now?
So the first thing that I would like to say is that our organization has been present in Afghanistan and working in Afghanistan for over 30 years. And that creates deep links to people, to institutions, and to governments, of course. So for our work to be realized, we need dialogue and we need access. And over the past year, I think we can recognize and note that there have been evolutions. For example, the active front lines and the presence of multiple checkpoints around the country have disappeared. There is an ease in access for Afghans to travel across the country that has to be recognized, and that has also had an effect on access for certain humanitarian organizations. At the same time, I think we can say very honestly that the decrease in fighting and intensity has, of course, not resolved overnight the profound suffering that exists across Afghanistan. And I say this from the perspective of somebody who has worked in Afghanistan, of the 1,900 ICRC staff who are currently in Afghanistan and work with the Afghan Red Crescent. We see the issues close at hand. And I believe that there are three main reasons for the ongoing profound humanitarian challenges in the country. One is the legacy of 4 decades of war. You cannot walk away from that.
No.
And there isn't a single Afghan family, and I hope that the Kabul participants agree with my characterization, there isn't a single Afghan family that has not been impacted in some way, that hasn't had a relative killed or injured or disappeared or detained over all these years of fighting. Infrastructure has been damaged and destroyed. That legacy one cannot walk away from, and it will require collective work on the part of all of us to overcome. The second element is, of course, and it has been mentioned, the effect in economic terms of the sanctions. There are sanctions, lack of employment opportunities, the frozen banking system and the assets. That is a big issue that is impacting Afghan lives.
$7 billion is like a big money for Afghan right now.
And it's impacting lives in very concrete ways. And I think this is why the ICRC calls for states around the world to overcome the reluctance to engage.
Yeah.
We need engagement. To resolve humanitarian issues, you need dialogue, you need engagement. And the third point, which has also been mentioned, which is the inflation, which has been generated in part by the effects of the Ukraine conflict. So I think these are very severe issues. And I would just add to this briefly that humanitarian organizations like the ICRC can do a lot, and we have increased, almost doubled the budget that we have, up to 200 million Swiss francs for this year in Afghanistan. But nobody wants, not the ICRC nor any Afghan, wants humanitarian responses to be the horizon. The horizon has to be something else. Humanitarian responses can be a bridge to something different, but the horizon has to be improved economic circumstances, cooperation, and economic investment. That is definitely what is needed for Afghanistan.
That is very crucial. These can be termed as theories, and yet there are on-the-ground stories that are taking place. Earlier, we managed to interview some of your colleagues on the ground. Let's take a look at the excerpts of that. The head of the delegation of ICRC in Afghanistan. Of course, that is only one of the many humanitarian organizations that are operating right now in Afghanistan. Take a look.
The humanitarian challenge for the Afghan population is becoming increasingly more complex by the day. The consequences of the economic sanctions imposed on Afghanistan since the takeover last year, as well as climate change and consequences of the degradation of the economic situations, including as well the inflation, which is increasing due to other crises around the world, including in Ukraine, is bringing to the Afghan population more difficulties to find economic opportunities, and for an increasing number of Afghans, more difficulties to put food on their table. The economic situation in Afghanistan is being weakened by different factors. One of them is that the banking system is not working properly. The private sector has difficulties to invest, to provide jobs to the community. But as well, because of the international situation linked to other crises, such as the crisis in Ukraine, for instance, commodity prices on the international markets are increasing. And this has an impact on the prices on the markets here in Afghanistan, which is making the situation for the lay Afghan families increasingly more difficult to pay for the commodities that they need for their survival on a daily basis. So this is where the fragility of the whole of the Afghan population is actually on the increase, and where organizations, humanitarian organizations such as the ICRC, needs to increase their support to them. A year ago, upon the launch of specific economic sanctions on Afghanistan, the public sector in general and health sector in particular, including hospitals, were facing huge shortage in fundings because development agencies, international financial institutions stopped to provide the funding necessary to the functioning of the public services. This is when organizations such as the ICRC and others have started to coordinate their actions in order to prioritize which sectors in public services would be supported in priority. And here the ICRC, because of our connections, strong connections with the health sector in Afghanistan, we have decided to bring the funding necessary to maintain 34 hospitals across the country functioning, in bringing the finance necessary for them to pay the salaries for their staff, to pay for the running costs, and to pay as well for the supplies of medicines.
Go to you, Senior Colonel Joe, about that. You are the military expert. One of the things our Afghan guest mentioned is the stability in the country. And also on top of that, how to build the peace structure in a way. Tell me more your thoughts on that. And I'll also follow up with something related to China.
Well, I think the greatest relief is that the war is over. The war that has lasted for 20 years, which was described internationally as a forever war, even by the Americans themselves. So this, of course, invites the question, would such peace be sustainable or not? Yes, there are some problems in the country. There are also some other terrorists, but I believe by and large, this provides the greatest opportunity for people to reconstruct or rebuild this country. In this regard, China, of course, would...
on the humanitarian crisis.
Yeah, can play such a great role. I slightly disagree with what the second gentleman said. I think Mr. Suleiman, when he talked about the indifference from the international community, I would just argue the other way around, because Afghanistan is certainly a country that lives to a great extent on blood transfusion from the international community. Probably,
for decades.
Yeah, probably for more than 70% of its capacity what comes from outside. Then, but what we are seeing is that at least the 3 ministerial meetings of Afghan's neighbors already convened, with the last one convened in China in March this year. And actually, when I read the declaration, I was somewhat touched. I'm not only impressed, because in this declaration, it's not only about political goals or objectives, which are normally found in many declarations, but this is actually a list of what each individual countries can do to help Afghanistan. And even those countries who are not necessarily directly neighbors, such as Russia, would even make a pledge. So as far as China is concerned, China pledged to start with, providing food, vaccines, and then more investment, and even the potential possibility of linking the China's Belt and Road Initiative into Afghanistan. And we're also talking about solar power or about the capacity building. And capacity building actually is one area that every country has pledged, those neighboring countries, to talk about how they can help Afghanistan. And in China's meeting, it's not only about these neighboring countries.
Okay.
We also invite major powers like Russia, like United States, or even the acting minister of Afghanistan to come to discuss. So this shows how the international community, in spite of the crisis in Ukraine, is still trying to help Afghanistan as much as possible.
But to you, what is the focus of the humanitarian crisis help, in a way, that you are looking at Afghanistan?
Well,
very briefly.
Yeah, humanitarian crisis, of course, is a fact. But I believe, first of all, it takes some time for Afghan people themselves to figure out a way how they can just work it out with possible assistance from the international community.
You're watching our special program, Afghanistan in Transition.
The year after a troubling US withdrawal. Afghanistan amid famine, violence, humanitarian crisis, buckling under a US-sanctioned economy.
The humanitarian situation was exacerbated. It pre-existed. So when we came to power, it was exacerbated by the automatic sanctions that were leveled against Afghanistan.
Can external aid be the lifeline? What's needed to rebuild a nation?
We reached 97% of the 24.4 million people in need. These efforts helped us avert a famine last winter, but we can't slow down.
China supports Afghanistan in finding its own path of peace and reconstruction.
A glimmer of hope for an Afghanistan at peace. Catch Afghanistan in Transition, a special TV forum presented by CGTN.
You are watching CGTN's special program, Afghanistan in Transition. This is a joint production between CGTN and Shamsha TV in Afghanistan. We have two studios, both in the CGTN studio here at the headquarters and also in Kabul with our colleagues in Afghanistan. Now, let's have Xu Zhaojun, my co-worker there, to bring out more insights from our guest over there.
Thank you, Tianwei. Gentlemen, now I have a few more questions for you, and I will concentrate on the humanitarian aid this time. And first of all, for Mr. Balkhi, we know that Afghan people are coping with earthquake and a drought, these natural disasters. China has been delivering humanitarian aid to the country, and the China is keeping its promise to help rebuild Afghanistan. I'm sure that the aid China provides has been given to those who are in urgent needs. And my question is, how do you find the response, not only from China, but the international community, the response to Afghanistan's call for help?
The response of China when it comes to the humanitarian needs of Afghanistan is very much appreciated. They do take into consideration some of our priorities when we convey our messages to them. So we appreciate that very much, even though China was not involved in the 20-year occupation, but for them to step up and help Afghanistan when it comes to the recovery of the people of Afghanistan, of the country. We appreciate it very much. At the same time, we also appreciate the humanitarian assistance that is being provided by the international community and other states. Afghanistan is a natural disaster-prone country, like many other states. So that aid and assistance, when it does come in a time of need, we try to distribute it to those in dire need. So we also appreciate that aspect, but it is very important to remember that humanitarian assistance is a stopgap measure. It is not that it's something sustainable. We, as Afghanistan and the outside countries, the neighboring regional, international community, the UN and other international bodies, need to work jointly to try to address the economic aspect, to let Afghanistan have a functioning economy and end this blockade, this collective punishment of the people of Afghanistan. I mean, do they not have a right to a normal life just like any other state? So we need to work on the economic aspect, although we appreciate the humanitarian side of it.
Thank you, Mr. Balkhi. And second question for Mr. Suleiman. I'm afraid this is not about economy, but it's also quite important. Do you think the world is still paying enough attention to the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, or the global attention has been focused elsewhere, like some conflicts in other continents?
Yes, definitely. The attention given to Afghanistan in the last 1 year has decreased significantly. I think the war in Ukraine has turned all of the global powers' attention into Europe and away from Afghanistan. And this is the reason why we are having this economic catastrophe in Afghanistan and the dire humanitarian situation that we witnessed today and you're witnessing in Kabul and other parts of Afghanistan is simply because of the indifference showed by global powers and regional powers. We all understand that we cannot do business with the rest of the world because our correspondence banking has stopped. So any humanitarian aid is, well, though appreciated, I would agree with Mr. Balkhi, but it's not the key to our success. It's not sustainable. And I think everybody needs to understand that if some collective actions are not taken, which are concrete steps, maybe I can talk about it later, I think the situation is going to go more worse and worse for the Afghan communities and for the Afghan people.
Thank you, thank you. And Professor, what's your comments and insight on the international attentions for the Afghan issue?
First of all, you know, as Mr. Balkhi also mentioned that, we appreciate about that. But I think Afghanistan, it is the heart of Asia. And it is have a lot of resource for their own. And so no need for humanitarian aid if they release they find the sanction and also release the money and also let the Afghan people develop their countries. That's the important things. For me, that's important for China country as our neighbor country, and also in the same time, it is in one of the most powerful economic and in the world. So I wish they take another step to put their pressure on the international community to release the money of Afghanistan, and also to let Afghan people have a life. Because, you know, as I have seen the government policies, they are shown to all neighboring countries, to international countries. They don't want to fear internal policies of the countries. On the same time, they request or they want the same things to give respect to Afghan people. And after this 20 years of war, and it is unfair war, and they not did any good things for Afghanistan, and they should have the now social responsibility they have to protect the Afghan people and let them have a life, and also the improvement of the economy. But if in the same time we appreciate the humanitarian rights, but in the same time, it is not for long period. I don't think it will be for next year the same situation. The people were the countries, all the world, they have another countries. There is a problem. There is many another crisis coming.
Yes, indeed.
So it will be not workable in the near future.
Okay, thank you, Professor. My next question goes to Beijing for Pierre. All the gentlemen have mentioned a very important thing, which is the sustainability of humanitarian aid and support for the development of the country and its people. Pierre, my question is that from the perspective of ICRC, what sort of mechanism is mostly needed to address Afghanistan's humanitarian needs in a sustainable way?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's a very important question, because I can tell you that from a humanitarian perspective, it was never planned, it was never foreseen that an organization like the ICRC or many other organizations should be present in a country like Afghanistan for almost 4 decades now. You know, humanitarian work was envisaged as a short-term intervention to help address emergency needs in a time of armed conflict or crisis, and then things move back into a political, social, and development realm. But many of the conflicts that we see around the world today are long-term, protracted conflicts, and that has been the case in Afghanistan as well. And I just want to highlight here that one of the reasons for this is that the systems in place in the international community for the moment to either prevent armed conflict or resolve them are particularly weak and have not shown great result or resolve. And I think new ideas are needed in that regard, because we cannot be expected as humanitarian organizations to fill these gaps for decades. That was not the idea, and I really have to identify with the fact that any country on the planet, and this includes Afghanistan, wants to hold the destiny of its own future in its hand. That is totally necessary, it's understandable, it's legitimate. And humanitarian organizations fill those gaps, are bridging elements, and I think our colleagues in Afghanistan are doing tremendous work. But as I said before, it now requires engagement by states in cooperation together in multilateral forms to support the path that Afghanistan is on in many different ways, and to overcome some of the reluctance in that regard if the focus on Afghan men and women and children is indeed the center of the attention. And that cannot be resolved only through humanitarian assistance, very clearly. That requires economic investment, that requires development cooperation. And here, many of the actors that withdrew last year, should also be called on to re-engage with the country.
Thank you, Pierre. Thank you very much. Today we have got so many interesting opinions and useful suggestions from our guests. And Tianwei, do you have any, and the guests from Beijing, in Beijing studio, do you have any other points to add, or do you have any more questions for the guests in Kabul studio.
Absolutely. Thank you, Zhao Quan. We are having rounds of sophisticated discussions about the policy, about the structure, about long-term. But I do also want to focus on some of the short-term issues, as we are focusing on humanitarian crisis for this episode of our program. One of it is food. If you look at some of the latest numbers that we can find on food, this is certainly a biggest concern. Earlier, CGTN talked to Mary Ellen McCarthy, who is the World Food Program Country Director in Afghanistan. Let's take a listen and find out what about the food that the Afghans need every day on their table.
In the latest assessment that we released back in May, in Gore province, we had 2 districts that fell into what we call phase 5, 20,000 people. And, just underscoring that really the situation in Afghanistan is extremely fragile. Households have exhausted all mechanisms that they have to be able to feed themselves. 18.9 million people, that's almost 50% of the population. It's phenomenal. And 6 million within that are one step away from what we call famine-like conditions. What that means practically is that on a daily basis, at least once a day, they cannot get an adequate meal to be able to feed themselves and their family. Decades and decades of conflict, recurrent droughts, the COVID crisis that had a terrible socioeconomic impact, and then the economic crisis, the loss of jobs, the economic footprint that went with the middle classes when they left, the economic footprint that went with the international community. So over the last year, the thing that has been most difficult from me is, the scale of the humanitarian crisis, but also the issues around women and girls have been particularly heartbreaking and difficult. The fact that you're a woman, that you cannot go to work, or that you have to stay, in your house and you can't go out unaccompanied, it's very, very difficult.
That's an excerpt of the interview with the World Food Program people on the site in Afghanistan. So I want to go to the spokesperson of the foreign ministry in Afghanistan. I know there are very limited resources for the government right now to operate so that to deal with all the problems. But food is very urgent. On that, what are you doing? How to make sure some of the, the mouth in Afghanistan can be fed at least?
Coming to the question of food security in Afghanistan, Afghanistan is geographically located in a place where it will most likely then not run into any food insecurity issues. The reason for that is because we have a lot of very rich countries in terms of agriculture and food products around us. And it is also located strategically where all the trade has to go through Afghanistan. Even currently, where we do have and are experiencing a humanitarian situation, again, although I do not agree with the assessment of some international bodies, not completely, although there is a humanitarian situation, there is no food shortages either in Kabul or any of the other provinces. So that question is more related to the liquidity crisis and the lack of jobs for the people to make an earning and then go and buy their food. So from our assessment, the Afghanistan is very secure when it comes to food security.
Thank you, sir. Senior Colonel Joe.
Well, I think it's very interesting for me to hear this kind of counter argument because previously I read New York Times and it was actually said that during the harsh winter, 1 million children could die. But I also learned from the ICRC representative in Kabul telling us that actually the Afghan people have managed better to not let this happen. But I'm happy to hear that in Kabul, at least, there is no such a serious problem of food shortage. And I believe in him because if the spokesman of Afghanistan to say there's no such a problem in the streets of Kabul. I think it's true, but then the other question comes as to how we could actually provide more jobs to these people. But I think the economist just now mentioned one serious question, whether China could actually add some pressure on the United States to give back the money of Afghan people to Afghan. This is a very good question. And I believe because the United States apparently, has freezed the $7 billion US, which is a lot of money, especially for Afghanistan. And this money, of course, belongs to Afghan people, even if it is allocated internationally, but you should give it back to Afghan people. With such excuse that, it has something to do with 9/11, therefore you have to halve it to give it to the victim of the relatives of 9/11. It's not justifiable because in the two aircraft that bumped into the Twin Towers, the terrorists are not Afghan people at all. So I think this is a reasonable request for Afghan people to ask the U.S. government to give back their own money. That makes sense.
In our discussion today, we not only talked about the short-term issues, emergencies, such as food, and also medicine on the ground in Afghanistan, but also some of the middle and long-term issues, how to make sure it's not just about dealing with emergencies every day. It's about building a long-term structure so Afghans, the hardworking Afghans, will be able to figure out their future on their own. We'd like to call for consistent attention and care for those who have been suffering amid a severe humanitarian crisis. We ask for joint efforts to bring conflict-torn countries back to stability and prosperity. Now, let me thank my colleague Xu Zhaoqun, together, particularly with our guests in the Kabul studio, joining us from Afghanistan, and also our guest in the Beijing studio, Senior Colonel Zhou Bo and Piek, for joining us on this important topic. We would love to thank our colleagues with Shamsha TV in Afghanistan. This is a special program, Afghanistan in Transition, a discussion on solving humanitarian challenges in that country. Stay tuned. We will have another discussion on the path to rebuilding the country, Afghanistan. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of CGTN's teams, both in Beijing and Kabul, thank you for watching, and bye for now. All the best to the people in Afghanistan.